Sorry, I battered away your nice little segue there to Manchester City Council meeting, which, interestingly, the council's in purdah currently because there is the mayoral election in, I think, 30th of July, so a couple of weeks' time. So there was a lot of drama today because they're not showing it on the live stream as they normally will, and they're delaying it until after the election for mayor takes place. So this is kind of like exclusives that I'm sharing. There was a lot of problem, which I found interesting, with which councillors could say what, because two of the councillors present are candidates for that mayoral election. So Richard Kilpatrick of the Lib Dems and Sian Astley of Reform. Bev Craig, who's the Labour leader of Manchester City Council, was not present at the meeting, so she chose not to be there. And there was an attempt to stop people from speaking because they said they were using it as a political platform. And when it was pointed out that the event wasn't live streamed, they said, well, what about the public gallery? I'm sat in the public gallery with 6 other people, and I thought, don't worry, guys, we're not going to swing the election. But the reason I bring it up is that there was this motion it was a motion against far-right rhetoric, and it was proposed by a councillor of the Green Party. And it was there was an amendment made by somebody of the Labour Party, which the Green Party had agreed to. So there was cross-party support for this, and Reform were the only ones to speak up against it. And I will try and steelman the position because obviously I'll give my opinion as we talk about this. I'm very much against the motion. But the idea with it was that we're seeing much more far-right violence on our streets. We're seeing protests outside asylum hotels. They quoted the asylum hotel, which we talked about in the podcast 2 weeks ago, which is just up the road from me in South Manchester. And they said that these people are coming from outside of the town, and they're coming to intimidate vulnerable people that are asylum seekers that are inside these hotels. They said we have to condemn it and we have to push back, and we cannot allow parties like Reform to use this for their political advantage, to whip up rhetoric that has nothing to do with legitimate political opinions about immigration. And that is the motion. So what do we think about
that? Well, I think legitimate opinions about immigration, well, all opinions are legitimate, aren't they? Why would you argue that some opinions aren't legitimate?
What you're saying is who gets to decide what is legitimate and what is not. You know, that's what the political process is for, to decide whether these opinions are valid and to hear from the people so that you can represent them. And it seems like the concern that I would have, and maybe you would share, is that it's quite anti-democratic, and it's crossing over the line from genuine concern for political violence and actually trying to stop people from expressing and having the right to express their political views.
Yeah. And this motion was about any kind of public expression of views. It wasn't about the expression of those views within the council. So
it was a really, really long motion.
Right.
And it had loads of different things about what they're going to do. A lot of it was fluff, as you might imagine. The Reform spokesperson, a chap called Dylan Evans, Councillor Dylan Evans from Charlestown, he spoke up and explained that whilst they're trying to condemn far-right rhetoric and saying this isn't about legitimate political opinion, at the same time they're attacking Reform, a legitimate political party that is represented in the Council of Manchester. And he said that those two things don't go hand in hand. So a lot of this was focusing on things like the Equality Act and the Human Rights Act, and saying we have to make sure that we don't allow a future government to repeal these things, and we reassure the citizens of Manchester that their human rights won't be affected.
It doesn't sound like a sensible way for a council to be spending its time. Did anybody mention the potholes at this stage?
No, and I spoke to the few other people in the public gallery, and I said the entertainment that this is giving us is probably in equal measure to the detriment of the council, because they should be speaking about boring things like potholes and bins, but instead they're speaking about national political issues. But it fitted so well with the discussion that we were going to have. And they obviously brought up the tragic case of Anne Widdecombe being murdered, and that political violence does seem to be on the rise. And what I found interesting is something we talk about, is the breakdown of the political. And they were, I think, unaware of the fact that, or perhaps even maybe sneering of the populace, thinking that the populace are going to be in favour of political violence. So they're trying to prevent the electorate from having their will heard. And I would say, as a Democrat and somebody that believes in democracy, fundamentally, that I trust the British public, and I trust that the political violence is being perpetrated by a very, very small minority of the electorate. And actually, we have to re-engage the public and allow them to have their voices heard. And often, and I think this came up at the Spiked Summit, Luke, often those that are perhaps less, a bit more colourful with their language, are ones that aren't super engaged in politics. And as we try and demonise them for that, it's just going to put people off, expressing their opinion.
Yeah, there's a lot to come up there. I mean, I think I'll start by saying that words aren't violence. And I think we over the last sort of 15 or 20 years, maybe longer, we've elided those two things quite significantly in how we talk. So the idea that an argument can do someone harm is quite common. And I remember being at university and people saying that some of the ideas we were debating at our debating society threatened people's physical safety. And this idea, I think, had a lot of strength on university campuses. So a lot of campuses started to adopt restrictive practices on freedom of speech because they took certain arguments to actually be dangerous for students and to threaten their safety. And I think we've allowed that argument to, the people that were students when I was at university are now in significant areas of public policy. Wes Streeting was head of the NUS when I was at Sussex. He used to come speak at our campus occasionally. So this is not to be underestimated, the influence of campus culture in the, early 2010s or just before 2010 and now, because you're now seeing the people who came of age in that period where speech was thought to be physically harmful are now making policy and perhaps even sitting in councils. On Anne Widdecombe, I think the police are in a really tricky position sometimes, because one thing that's been very interesting in the aftermath of this appalling killing is they were criticised after Southport for not being able to say anything and keeping silence for quite a long time, and then coming out with some facts. And on this occasion, they came out very quickly, but told us something that was completely wrong. And so I do get that the police are in a double bind. If they say something that they think too early, they'll be criticised, and if they don't say anything, they're criticised for holding back. But I think the police just need to hold the investigative line and understand their job properly. So what that means is prioritise the investigation and don't worry about anything else. Because what is in the back of their minds is they think it's their job to control the public and to make sure that the public don't protest and come out on the street. And, the moment that there is disorder, or the moment that a killing is used for some kind of political purpose, the police seem to think that that's part of their responsibility to prevent. You saw this in the aftermath of Southport, where you see it also in the aftermath of the Henry Novak killing, where effectively the police were criticised again for not properly controlling the narrative, and this leading to violent protests in the name of Henry Novak. So the police sort of now, I think, it's just clear that they see as part of their role the control of information and therefore the management of the public. And so that's what's given them this double bind, because they won't ever win that. They won't ever get that right. What they can get right is just sticking to, well, we need to find out what happened. We need to find out what happened accurately, fast as possible. And we can't jeopardise that by telling the public anything too soon or too late. And I think if they just refocused on their investigative purpose and their job, then they'd be able to make that balance work a lot better than they currently are. On the Human Rights Act and the Equalities Act, just briefly, if I can, it is extraordinary to me that the position that these particular pieces of legislation have taken in the public imagination. So it's almost seen like if we repeal the Human Rights Act, we will return, and this is said all the time, we will return to Berlin in the 1930s. That's said fairly often about the possible impact of repealing the Human Rights Act. Similarly, with the Equalities Act, they say, people say, well, if we repeal the Equalities Act, men and women will immediately be unequal in the workplace again. And there'll be no protections for people being paid differently or suffering racial discrimination. It's just nonsense. It is complete and utter nonsense because, firstly, the Human Rights Act incorporates a piece of law from Europe, the European Convention on Human Rights. And the European Convention on Human Rights was based on the common law rights that were drawn from English common law. So common law is the law made by our domestic courts, by judges. And so, for example, the right to trial by jury is a common law right. It's something that's emerged in the law courts as a result of senior judicial figures, as a result of developments in the trial process. It's not something that was created by the European Convention on Human Rights, and it's not something that will go away because we repeal the Human Rights Act. In fact, as you've seen, the right to jury trial is being diluted thanks to David Lammy and his proposals to limit jury trials domestically. So the Human Rights Act largely draws on our own history of common law freedom. And if we got rid of it, firstly, we could immediately pass legislation that protected the freedoms that we really wanted to protect, if we wanted to do that. But we could also repeal some of the some of the legislation that actually limits our freedom in this country. So we could roll back on some of the pieces of anti-free speech law that we see being used to prosecute people all the time. So getting rid of the Human Rights Act wouldn't mean a return to the 1930s. In fact, I think it would mean us looking again at some of where these freedoms are in our national conversation and thinking about how we can really robustly protect civil liberties rather than relying on the European Court of Human Rights to do it for us. So that's it. Just on that, it's interesting that those two pieces of legislation come up at a local council meeting and are discussed in such vehement terms. I thought that was worth noting.
The really interesting aspect of this for me is that as Democrats and as people that believe in the sovereignty of Parliament, we think that a future generation should be able to build the political will to do something and to change the laws that we are implementing, or we in an SDP government might implement. That was made by the Reform Councillor, and somebody in the public gallery said to me, yeah, but what if the future public vote for slavery? Would we allow that to happen? And I think that part of the breakdown of the political, and this is something we talk about all the time, is that we've lost a sense of how you enact change and how you build a political consensus for something. I think the concerns from the other side, and I'm really trying to get into the head, which might be a dangerous practice, and perhaps I shouldn't be doing it, but I think the concerns are they think that there is certain legislation that has been passed in previous decades, let's say, that enables us to have more equality, to treat each other fairly, and they think that their political enemies are, I would say, exploiting certain sentiments in the British public in order to put forward a malevolent agenda, which would include repealing certain legislation. So when you say we could repeal the Human Rights Act and then immediately pass legislation in order to protect certain rights, the argument would be, but they're not going to do that. They're trying to take away our rights. This is a question for both of you, is there any merit to that concern that that's what the political right is trying to do?
I mean, I think one of a lot of this stems from the EU, and I know I'm always blaming the EU for everything, but I do think that, I mean, certainly if you play that argument in a kind of trade union framework, so trade unions would defend to the death the Equality Act and all the things that flow from it, and in fact, the current government is actually trying to strengthen the Equality Act in some ways in terms of how you define work of equal value. And they would think, they've been given the impression that all of those rights are things that we inherited from Europe. They don't think that those things were fought for and won by workers in the UK, which they were, so things like an Equal Pay Act we had before we had, EU requirements. But they've kind of got this kind of good and evil schema in their head that says these things on the good side, these things on the bad side. And on the good side are the EU, the Equality Act, all those kind of things that are kind of code-based way of running your life. And they've absolutely absorbed that idea that you can't just have informal relations and ways of working, and you can't have a law that just says everything's legal unless we've said it's illegal. They've adopted this, I would say it's a very European stance of saying that the law has to codify and write down everything that we can and can't do. And so if you living within that world where the law has to do all those things, if you're going to take that law away to them, I think that does mean you then leave them in limbo where anything could happen. And I think because they do see things like change as a bad thing, they don't think change is a good thing, change is generally a bad thing. I think they do automatically think that would make the world worse. And I do think that, and you say you're trying to get inside their heads, and I do think it's important to try and understand where people are coming from politically, because I think there's just a danger at the moment in popular discourse of people just, divided into tribes and almost willfully not understanding each other. And I don't think that's helpful. I think we've got to try and understand where people are coming from. And that's why I say, when the people who complained about Jamie Michael, I think probably did think that they were doing the right thing. And they feel that, you always have to look to the law, the state, to intervene in those human relationships and make them functional. So I kind of think the only way to build a belief in our ability to get along as people and to have agency and to change the world for good is to do that at a kind of really basic human level. I'm back to mending my park benches again, really. That I think you've got to go out and do those kind of things and show people that you can make a difference and you can, working together without the state intervening, you can make those kind of differences.
Just on your point about could a democracy pass an act supporting slavery? I mean, if we're in a society that in theory supports slavery, the law's not going to help, because you're in a very turbulent, violent society in that circumstance. And you saw this you actually did see this in Berlin in the 1930s, where a society, a populace, turned against a minority very violently. They could have had a Human Rights Act in 1930s Germany. It wouldn't have prevented anything. In fact, what people we really need to recognise is how weak those protections can be when it really matters. The reason they make those arguments is they get the relationship between social morality and the law largely the wrong way round. Almost always throughout history, the greatest gains in the law have come around as a result of a change in social attitudes, a mass change in social attitudes. You saw this most prominently in the American Civil Rights Movement, where, for example, the decision in Brown and Board of Education that prevented segregation in schools. I mean, firstly, that came at the end of a very sustained period of national protestation and a national movement. But also, it did not change minds in the way that wider society is capable of changing minds. What I mean by that is the fact that the Supreme Court had made this decision in Brown and Board of Education did not stop the problems in young black children going to mixed schools. In fact, it did the opposite. It kind of forced the issue on societies and sections of the society that weren't quite ready for it, and it created real tension. And there's a fantastic essay by Hannah Arendt on this issue called Reflections on Little Rock, which I always go back to when I'm thinking about the relationship between the law and social attitudes. And in this country as well, you see all the big changes that we like to talk about when we come to the law being more progressive, for example, the freeing up of sexual relationships, the decriminalisation of homosexuality, for example, those weren't examples where we passed a new law to protect homosexuals. Those are examples where we repealed laws that were criminalising homosexuals. And the difference is huge and really significant.